All right, we're good to go, I hope.
Yep.
All right, this presentation is about a site that has been frequently commented upon by archaeologists in the Southeast and Lower Mississippi Valley for the past 50 years. The information that we have about the site is the result of a salvage archaeological project carried out in the spring of 1967. And I hope to shed some light on what has previously been largely a rumor and present what we think we know about the Monsanto site. The most important assertion being that Mound A at the site is the oldest reliably dated earthen mound in North America. Some of the grayer heads in the audience may recognize these two now deceased people who were responsible for conducting much of the archaeology that was done at the site. Bill Hague was, of course, a well-known archaeologist at LSU, and Carl Cutter was active as an archaeologist in many settings throughout a long career. In 1967, Cutter was a graduate student at SIU Carbondale, but he had been an undergraduate studying with Hague at LSU. And much of the information presented here about the actual excavations has been made possible by the cooperation from Jenna Cutter, Carl's widow, who provided access to Carl's computer files and papers on Monsanto. Additional worthies who were involved with the project that some people may know about are Lanier Simmons, who played an important role in archaeology at Avery Island and in Louisiana's Antiquities Commission, and James A. Ford, who joined the work at Monsanto while he was visiting Hague in March of 1967. The Monsanto site was the last field work that James Ford participated in before his death a year later. And people, if you're familiar with Southeastern archaeology, you know the name James A. Ford. This slide gives you the location information about the Monsanto site, including the obligatory Google Earth image that all PowerPoint presentations have to have. It was located near the edge of the Pleistocene Terrace, where the rather inconsequential Monsanto Bayou runs into the Mississippi River on the Mississippi's eastern bank. Monsanto archaeological site was originally reported as consisting of two conical mounds by Dr. Fred Niffen in the 30s and given its site number. However, this Mississippi River Commission map dating to the late 1800s indicates that at least one of the mounds at the site was recognized and recorded decades before Niffen's report. In the spring of 1967, Dr. Hague received a phone call from the management at Allied Chemical Company telling him that the mounds and the rest of the site was going to be leveled for the construction of a chemical plant. Surprisingly, this part of Baton Rouge was overgrown with forest and secondary vegetation at the time. This slide shows the site being cleared of vegetation, before mapping, and it was primarily done by mechanical means. And the arrow points to a looter's pit on the summit and two individuals on Mound A's summit. This slide provides a view of the two mounds at the site once they had been cleared of vegetation. There is no doubt that some of the archaeological deposits were disturbed by this process, but Hague and his associates were working under an initial tight deadline of 4 days that was unexpectedly extended because of a labor dispute regarding the construction of the plant. Allied Chemical provided Hague with a bulldozer and a skilled operator to assist. And following what a few of you may recognize as a WPA style methodology, Hague, Ford and Company laid out a grid with stakes across the site at 10-foot intervals, and they constructed a contour map of the site. And this WPA strategy should not be surprising. as both Haig and Ford began their careers as archaeologists working on WPA projects in the 30s. Once the grid and map were accomplished, the mechanical excavations were carried out on Mound Day at the site by the excavation of 5 trenches through the mound. And I personally find this one of the most striking images of an archaeology site I've ever seen. This and many of the images from Haig's work are on Kodachrome color slides, which was a state-of-the-art technology in 1967. And Haig was the photographer of all these color slides and probably most of the black and white images we also have of the project. As the trenches were dug, artifacts were collected and profiles were cleaned and eventually recorded. We have the drawings of 2 of the 3 profiles that Haig and the others recorded. And these are significant in the eventual interpretation of Mound A's construction. Images of Profile A have not been found, and note in these profiles you have the primary mound, which is a small flat-topped mound, and then there's a level floor level here below that mound, below that small mound. This slide from the field shows the stratigraphic break between the primary mound and the subsequent mound fill, as well as the buried A horizon right here, or as Haig described it, as the original humus line. And by the way, this individual here is Carl Kuttruff, a 1967 version, before he had the ZZ Top type beard that most people knew him to have. Importantly and fortunately, Haig and his co-workers decided to continue excavating into the buried A horizon. And there they discovered a series of post holes that they eventually exposed to define an almost square structure that measured 33 by 32.5 feet. And that, of course, this structure would have preceded the construction of Mound A and was obviously part of the mound's placement. This slide gives you an idea of an overlay of the basic features involved in the construction of Mound A. Although Kuttruff has proposed a more involved construction process than this slide shows, there is the original post hole pattern right here, and then there was the primary mound built over that, and then the subsequent mound fill over that. And this slide also provides the dimensions in 1967 that the mound had, and you can see an idealized profile of the mound. There were also 5 artifacts that were recovered during the mechanical excavation from Mound A. There is a red jasper effigy bead that in 1967 was thought to be associated with Poverty Point, but which we know now also can date to the Middle Archaic. And according to Haig's notes, the fracture of this bead was done prehistorically rather than during the excavation of the mound. There were also 2 tubular beads from Mound A. The larger one is made from phyllite and the smaller one from greenstone. And both of these are metamorphic stones that do not occur in any geological formation anywhere near the site. Another significant artifact from Mound A was a large, thin, Benton-type biface that shows no use wear whatsoever on its distal edges, but does show that the base had been ground and polished, and shows no weathering patina on the artifact. And so that suggests that it was buried in Mound A, probably ceremonially. And this biface was perhaps part of what is called an atasa, or war club, and reflectance spectroscopy done by Dr. Ryan Parrish at the University of Memphis on this artifact suggests that its source, the source of the material, was from the Upper St. Louis Limestone Formation, which is now in what's now southern Illinois, and that's about 500 miles northeast of the Monsanto site. The fifth artifact from there was a single secondary chert flake that was recovered from one of the post holes of the submound structure. Its inclusion in that post hole was probably accidental. Mound B, the smaller of the two conical mounds, was excavated with 3 mechanical trenches more quickly and with less attention to Mound A. And that was because the labor strike that had extended the 4 days that Haig and his folks initially had been settled. And so they only had a couple of days to excavate Mound B before the construction of that chemical plant. And this mound measured 80 by 105 feet, and it was more oblong in its shape, and it was 6 foot high. And this is black and white photographs of those excavations taking place there. There were no maps available showing exactly where those trenches were in the mound, and nor were there any profiles recorded. Also, no artifacts were recovered from Mound B during these excavations, and there was no submound pattern of post holes detected. The most significant feature found at Mound B were concentrations of white soil, or blotches is what Haig and Ford called them, near the base of the mound. These blotches were reminiscent, to James Ford at least, of similar features that he had encountered at Mound B of the Poverty Point site, that he had conducted at the Poverty Point site more than 10 years earlier. This is the profile of Mound B at Poverty Point from Ford's report on his excavations. And you can see that the white blotches or white soils in this profile are in the interior of the mound, as opposed to the base of the mound of Mound B at Monsanto. The overwhelming majority of the artifacts recovered during the salvage investigations at Monsanto came from a midden area near the edge of the Pleistocene terrace, and there were no dimensions given for this midden area, and undoubtedly it was disturbed by the clearing of vegetation at the site. There were 10 projectile points recovered from that midden, with the diagnostic ones up at the top there identified as various archaic types, and the others were too damaged to be reliably classified. However, they do have corner notching, which suggests to me at least that they were archaic period dark points. We had no other projectile points from this collection other than these. There were also a variety of scrapers, some of which may have been hafted, but most seem to have a patina on them, suggesting sustained contact with a human hand. There's no map available showing exactly, excuse me. There were also cores and debitage recovered from the midden area, and these artifacts and the ones I just showed you were all made from chert gravels that could have been recovered from nearby stream beds or sandbars. And this kind of lithic material, of course, exists throughout the lower Mississippi Valley. There were, however, a few enigmatic artifacts from the Monsanto midden. There were micro drills or perforators, which are often associated with Poverty Point. There was a celt fragment, a hammerstone, possibly of limestone. And it's my experience that limestone is a relatively rare material here in the lower Mississippi Valley. There's also a very thick wedge of a chert formed from a chert cobble. There was a scraper showing edge wear around it that Haig classified as basalt, and that's a rare material. And then in this part of the lower valley, and this is a limonite abrading stone. There's an extensive groove in that stone, and that was likely there for working bone and wooden tools. And there none of these artifacts, except possibly the perforators, are associated, could be dated as diagnostic of any particular prehistoric culture. There were also some ceramics recovered from the midden at Monsanto, and these types are dated to Marksville incised and Marksville punctated rims, as well as a Coles Creek incised and Pontchartrain check stamp. And these few sherds that were recovered suggest a sporadic occupation at the site that spanned roughly 1,000 years, maybe AD 200 for the Marksville material to AD 1200 for the Coles Creek. There were also some historic artifacts recovered. There was suggesting a late 18th century occupation around the mounds. And most informative of these is the black pistol-sized gun flint there, which is an artifact associated with British occupations in colonial America. And then there's also a kaolin pipe stem and also some stoneware, and then there's also some sort of brass plate that I'm not sure what that is. And the map in this slide presents the location of the site during the relatively brief period of British West Florida, when British East Florida and West Florida were the 14th and 15th British colonies in North America. Haig reported bricks on the summit of Mound A, but he did not record how many there were or if they were made from low-fired, what we call plantation bricks here, or from more modern machine bricks. So that's an accounting of what was done. Before Haig and Ford started their work at the site, they had anticipated that they would be dealing with two Marksville period conical mounds on the banks of the Mississippi River, not unlike the Helena mounds in southeast Arkansas that Ford had excavated years earlier. They anticipated many log-covered tombs with numerous and complex burials. And as their mechanical excavations proceeded, they realized they were dealing with something very different. The effigy bead and the other beads, the large biface, the perforators, as well as the white blotches in Mound B, suggested to Haig and Ford that they were dealing with a Poverty Point era site. And Haig's earliest presentation about the site at an SAA meeting in 1968 said just that. By the late 1960s, the antiquity of such a complex and large site as Poverty Point had caused a shift in the prevailing theoretical paradigms concerning prehistoric mound sites. And that was the notion, but I think for most of it, certainly derived out of WPA era, people thought that mounds were built by sedentary ranked societies where the elites were ordering or coercing people to building mounds, and that in order to have a substantial enough population, you had to have agriculture. And that was the existing paradigm, and people thought that you would find maize at woodland period sites, and there were a lot of projects trying to find such a thing. But the antiquity of Poverty Point sort of stretched everybody's brain that the mounds could have been built much earlier than thought, and certainly in 1967, no one thought that there would be any mounds built earlier than Poverty Point, around 3,500 years ago. Thus, the initial radiocarbon dates obtained in 1967 of just over 6,200 years VP from Mound A at the Monsanto site was unthinkable. That would make that mound date to the Middle Archaic period, 6,000 to 2,000 BC. And not too many archaeologists in 1967 would have accepted that, and Haig didn't accept it himself. Now, however, there are at least 13 sites in Louisiana alone, including Monsanto, that have been proposed as Middle Archaic mound sites. And many of these are due to the work of the late Dr. Joe Saunders. And to a large extent, it was his work that made the idea of Middle Archaic mounds credible. There are additional Middle Archaic mounds in Mississippi, and I suspect others in the Southeast that haven't been investigated or detected yet. Well, let's go back to the radiocarbon dates we have for Monsanto. In addition to Haig's first dates, there are now 2 more dates from Mound A and 2 dates from Mound B. The 3 dates from Mound A, all from a cremation concentration known as Feature 1 atop the primary mound, are all in pretty good agreement, as you would suspect. The 2 dates from Mound B are almost identical, but just over 4,400 years ago. That raises the question of what was going on with a nearly 2,000-year gap between the constructions of these 2 mounds. That's a considerable span of time for some sort of cultural continuity, but that's the data that we have right now. For anybody's information, for your information, there are additional radiocarbon samples from the 1967 investigations that are available for future researchers. It's also worth noting that during the construction of the mounds at Monsanto, as indicated by the radiocarbon dates, the physical setting for the site may have been different from what it is today. It is likely that the main course of the Mississippi River was in what is now Bayou Teche to the west, and any stream at the base of the terrace where the Monsanto site was located was likely considerably smaller. So now we have the answers to some basic questions about the Monsanto site. We obviously know where, when, how, and with what the mounds were built, except for those white blotches in Mound B. The question of why, I think, should be somewhat self-evident for Mound A. It was a funerary memorial to a single or relatively few individuals. But perhaps the most important question to ask about the Monsanto site is who built it. And by who, I'm considering the type of society that constructed Mound A. Joe Saunders proposed in his analysis of 3 Middle Archaic mound sites in Louisiana were constructed. He proposed that they were constructed by egalitarian, seasonal hunter-gatherer folks with some of the social complexity, without some of the social complexity that archaeologists have traditionally assigned to mound sites. And he criticized the notion that the mounds themselves are indication of social inequality. He thought that was circular reasoning. More simply put, Saunders concluded that people didn't necessarily need social elites to direct them in the construction of mounds. At Monsanto's Mound A, however, the submound structure, which was surely a special non-residential construction, the buried cremations on a specially constructed platform mound with the subsequent monumental mound, along with the artifacts from distant sources, suggests a more hierarchical society, as the mound was built to honor a special individual or individuals. And finally, or almost finally, Diana Greenlee has provided this interesting slide, which shows the timing of what she calls pulses of mound building cultures during prehistory in the lower Mississippi Valley. The median dates for the 3 radiocarbon samples from Mound A at Monsanto would extend the Middle Archaic pulse about 1,000 years further into the past. And that suggests to me that there are probably other mound sites approximating Monsanto's antiquity still out there, yet to be discovered and investigated. The details of the information that I've presented here are available in the 2017 issue of Louisiana Archaeology, which is the bulletin of the Louisiana Archaeological Society, and it's available from the LAS website for $8. And I encourage everyone to get one and give one. And sadly, as this Google Earth image indicates, there's nothing left of the Monsanto site. Modern industrial facilities sit atop what was once a final resting place for an individual or individuals ceremonially honored thousands of years ago. And these are the folks that helped with the information for this presentation and for the production of the bulletin. And I'll close by quoting the greatest of all late Mississippians by saying, thank you, thank you, thank you very much. And that's it.
Thank you.
Any questions? Is everybody still there?
Yeah, we're here. Sorry, I was trying to like bring down the sharing page, but I don't know how to do it because but anyway, yes, we are here. And please, everybody, thank you, whoever did that. Please ask questions. This was a really awesome talk, and I thank you very much, Dennis. So,
well, sure. Jessica, if you liked it, thank Jessica. If you didn't like it, blame me.
I love you both.
Well, thank you so much for agreeing to talk to us about it. It is
sure.
Mounds are super interesting. Did you hear, Dennis? Do you remember years ago? Dr. Woody Gagliano gave a talk at one of the Louisiana meetings about all the Middle Archaic mounds, and he thought they were on interesting fault lines, that they were all in in a similar environmental zone. It was an interesting paper. I just wondered. I
did see that. I did hear that presentation, and you're right. That was some time ago, and he had a notion. He was mostly talking about there's a site on Avery Island. For those, if you know Louisiana's geology, there's the salt domes that are in almost coastal Louisiana. And One of them is Avery Island. That's where Tabasco sauce comes from. And there's a mound site called Banana Bayou there. And that was the one that that Woody Gagliano was most familiar with. And he was talking about, he had some radiocarbon dates that from that site that noted Middle Archaic. And like I'm saying, for years and years, the notion of a Middle Archaic mound was unacceptable to a lot of folks. And Joe Saunders should get the credit, I think, for making that sort of an acceptable notion. He overcame a lot of prejudice against such a thing exists, against Middle Archaic mounds, the concept. Anybody else?
Are they still doing work at Louisiana Mound? Oh, I'm sorry to talk over. Dennis, are they still doing work at the Louisiana? LSU Mound was all the rage a year or two ago.
Are they still doing
my
any
internet
work? You're
yeah,
asking.
weren't they?
Now, if you're asking about the LSU mounds, there's some controversy about the antiquity of that mound, that's been proposed by a geologist, and I question his conclusions and his methods. And Becky Saunders was involved with him initially in these investigations, and she does not think they have the great antiquity that this geologist proposed either. But that, you would think that the mounds at a large campus would be among the most researched mound sites in the country, and that's sadly not the case. There have been a couple of excavations. Well, I won't go into the history of that particular site, but it's not as well known as I would like, and I think most others. But I suspect, and it's only that, a suspicion, that the twin conical mounds, and those mounds at LSU are located on the edge of the Pleistocene terrace overlooking the Mississippi River floodplain, very similar setting to the Monsanto mounds. I suspect they're of similar antiquity.
I have a question. Can you clarify how this one, or this site is, how the mounds here are different than the other Middle Archaic mound sites in Louisiana? Do the other ones have sub-mound structure? Do the other ones have funerary features?
No
features?
That's no. The short answer is no, they don't. But none of them were excavated, leveled, and had at least some recording of them as they were leveled, like what they did. I mean, there may be a sub-mound structure, post hole. What that was it a charnel house? That's my suspicion, that was a charnel house, and that or it was a crematorium perhaps, and that the remains from that were then placed on the top of that smaller primary mound, and then that was covered over as some sort of monument. That's my interpretation. And now, as far as I know, and there are other folks more learned than me, we don't know from other Middle Archaic mounds what was going on.
Yeah, this just seems very different.
It is, well, it is, but I would say we don't know how different. But it is different also. And I was pointing out that Joe Saunders had talked about the possibility of breaking the paradigm about having a hierarchical society that in order you needed that to have a mound built. And so he was saying that 3 sites were possibly built by egalitarian bands. I think Monsanto did have a hierarchy involved, and it was from a relatively complex society by the fact that it was a funerary mound for an individual, and then you had these artifacts, exotic artifacts, or artifacts of exotic materials from the hundreds of miles away. I think that Benton point is connected with the Eva site and all those sites in the Benton culture or the sphere of influence, whatever it's called. I think that's an indication of some sort of connection there for that to have come that far to end up here in Baton Rouge, Louisiana.
Are there any more questions?
I have a little comment too. Dennis, you presented that paper at the meeting in Natchez, right? Last year, right before the COVID, right?
I did.
And then the guy that gave the paper that was controversial went like right after you, right before you, right?
Right.
Right. And he's like saying he has a mound that's like 8,000 or 10,000.
Yes, that's the LSU
like,
mound.
and he has it on some like columns of something, right? Well, how did that go? I forgot exactly. What was his basis?
Well, I feel I don't want to disparage. I like the guy personally, but I think his methods were all wrong. He has sent an article out for publication to, I think, Science, the journal Science, and maybe some other publications. And as far as I know, they're not accepted. I think he would let me know if they had been accepted
but he
by
was
a referee journal.
He was drilling the mound that's at LSU, the one that the kids all park on, and that's the reason they had to like rope it all off, right? It was like a
right. That was years ago. There was years ago. It was people could drive over and did drive over the mounds with cars, and a girl was unfortunately killed when this guy came over the summit of the mound and hit her and killed her. So they eventually built these retaining walls around the base of it back in, this would have been the mid 80s or late 80s. So there was not that much done then for that site. Like I say, I think it's a lot of irony that the LSU campus mounds, which are only a few miles south of where the Monsanto mounds were, that we know so little about that mound site.
Right. Let me ask one more question because
I
can't shut up, man. By the way, we got to go to a baseball game this summer. Okay. But
you're right. I dig it.
I'm watching the Cardinals right now. It's not going well. Tell me. So my other thing is okay. So you have all those archaic mounds. I mean, how come we don't have any in Arkansas? Okay. Is it now we're not looking right, or what's the deal? I know that in Little Rock at the old Coleman Dairy, there is some type of middle archaic, or like there's a mound that recovered at Evans Point. But other than that, I don't know of any other middle archaic sites or mounds. Is really what I'm interested in right now.
Is the Lake Enterprise mound site there in southeastern Arkansas? Is that
right? It is.
And that's the only one that comes to my mind.
That like there's a line at the border, you know.
Well, that's a good question. I mean, I was going to start this talk sort of the notion of mounds. Everyone, I'm sure most of you folks know that mounds were originally assigned to some sort of mythic mound builder group and so on, and we know I think the last mounds that were built and used are in Natchez, Mississippi. And we knew that. The French recorded it and told us all about it. But then during the 19th century, as the United States spread to the West, all these notions of mythic mound builders and European types built the mounds, and there was some sort of Armageddon type apocalyptic battle that the savage Indians killed all these noble mound builders, and then that's where the Europeans found them. So the mounds are the most obvious thing on the landscape. Archaeology, they're the most obvious thing there is, and I think that some of the first ones that were built they learned how to do it. And I think the first ones that were built had probably eroded away. I would suspect there's a lot that eroded away, but also at the Monsanto site, Carl Cutler proposed that there was a basal ring, sort of a donut, that served as sort of a retaining wall to help the mound survive more intact. And that's in fact a technique that's been seen in much later mounds as well. So that there's something, they didn't just pile the dirt up in baskets, basket loads of dirt. I mean, there was a lot more involved to it than that. I mean, so, and that special, the knowledge that is exhibited at the Monsanto site suggests to me that it wasn't the first. They had to have had previous attempts before they discovered these techniques that made the structures last longer. So that was a long ramble. I'm sorry. I'm happy y'all are sticking with it.
I have a question. How do these dates at Monsanto compare to the earliest mounds in Mesoamerica?
These would be earlier. I mean, the earliest mounds that come to my mind are the Olmec, which are in on the Gulf Coast of the Gulf of Mexico coast. I forget the Mexican state right offhand, but it's around Veracruz. And there's a few sites, and they are comparable in dates to the Poverty Point site, is my recollection. In fact, when Clarence Webb and James Ford were first looking at the Poverty Point site in the 60s, Clarence Webb especially, I think, was enamored of the notion that there was some sort of connection between the Olmecs and the Poverty Point culture. And I personally don't think there was, but they were roughly contemporary. And so the Middle Archaic is even older than the Olmec mounds, earthen mounds that exist. It's been a long time since I've thought about the Olmecs.
Are there any more questions?
Well, I appreciate y'all sticking around.
Dennis, it was great. It really was. And thank you for your patience. And
oh, no, I enjoyed it. Thank you, folks. Have a good
Great job.
All right. Bye-bye.
you all take care. Thank you for being here.